So good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. As JC said, I'm a data storyteller. And what that means is I get to work with organizations to make sense of their data and to help them, I guess, put it to work and really lead action and change from the data. I've been doing this work now full time for the last couple of years. Prior to that, I finished my doctorate. And I got into the space of working with data, largely through the experience that I had working in the UK. I have a teaching background, but this idea of using data and putting it into action obviously transcends schools. It's everywhere at the moment. It's certainly a hot topic. There's a number of different summits and conferences available on using data and how we actually do that. So what it's meant is that I get to go into organizations and work with them on what the data actually means, how they can use it, and what it means for the future of their clients, their patients, their employees, and their organization as a whole. So the reason why I decided to call this session this morning, why having data is not enough, is because over the next 3 days, you're going to hear a lot about different cloud services for healthcare data. You're going to hear a lot about healthcare information technology. And all of that is really important because we need super secure methods of containing all of the data. We need, technology and support that actually helps us use it really well and use it in a way that's actually going to benefit our clients and benefit our key stakeholders. But to be completely honest, at the end of the day, you can have the best technology in the world, but unless you actually get to the point of using the data and engaging in data storytelling, you could invest a lot of money and it could all really be for waste, because those brilliant technological tools are limited by the human use of them. So often when I get to work in organizations, I go in and people often say to me, Selena, we've just got so much data, we don't know what to do with it. And so, really kind of common challenges that I hear is that, over time, the expectations of using data in organizations, the technology and the data sources themselves have just been kind of piled on top of each other. And there's just more and more data coming in. And often organizational leaders or practice leaders in many of your cases haven't had that opportunity to really zoom out and think kind of strategically and deliberately about what they actually want to get out of it and what they intend to use. So that's why we're here today talking about that. So, over the next 3 days, really enjoy and really get into the technology part, but keep in the back of your mind always that, what's your follow-up, how you're actually going to use that information that you've got access to. So we all come to this conversation with really different experiences and exposure to data. There's plenty of people who got into healthcare, into the field of healthcare, because they want to take care of humans. They want to make a difference in the lives of other people. They didn't necessarily get into the healthcare profession to track a whole stack of numbers and to be, kind of knee deep in Excel spreadsheets and data. So sometimes there's some real fear for some people around what the concept or the idea of using data actually means. But at the same time, there's also a lot of data collection, particularly like health monitoring, that comes really naturally to a lot of different practitioners. So it's kind of the use of data and the level of comfort that people have with data is it's a sliding scale and it's a continuum. And depending on people's role and exposure and experience at any one time, they can move up and down on that continuum. So just kind of wherever you're at today and wherever you come to this conversation is absolutely okay. You're very welcome, but just be aware that it's okay to be wherever you're at and wherever, whatever level of comfort you might have. I guess there's a couple of things that I like to, precede any of these conversations with about the lenses and the views that I bring to the use of data. So for me, this really started for me as a teacher, working and realizing that I could make a really targeted and specific, or have a really targeted and specific impact on individual students and small groups. And that was where I really started to see that data had incredibly transformational power around when we engaged with humans and when we focused on the humans and the data storytelling. So for me, there's a real key difference between being data informed and not data driven. So that's something that I have learned throughout my career, and it's reaffirmed to me every time I go into a different organization and, you know, talk about the data with them. We can't ever be data driven. And so JC and I caught up about a week ago and we talked about this. And, you know, data driven, when people are data driven, they're really, that they've almost got blinkers on and they're focused on the numbers only, and they don't necessarily take into consideration the people and the context and the human element. That's, you know, we should never do that, because if we just rely on the numbers, we absolutely run the risk of getting things wrong because we don't take that human dynamic changing environment into consideration. And at the same time, it's really hard to motivate people to engage in data conversations when you're driven by numbers. So we always want to be data informed. And when we're informed by the data, we're curious about it. We ask questions. We ask other people what they see and what they think, and what, you know, kind of brainstorm some potential ideas and solutions. But we also use the data that we've got in conjunction with our understanding of our, you know, it might be your practice, it might be your, you know, the organization that you work with, the people that you work with, you know, the model in which you all work. It's taking all of those factors into consideration with the hard data, with the quantitative numbers, to inform our decision making. So it's a really kind of key belief that I bring to this conversation about being data informed and not data driven. The other one that I often talk about is the idea of using multiple sources of data. So again, you'll hear a lot over the next couple of days about different technology and the different ways that you can store and collect and maintain really secure data in cloud services. I'd encourage you through that process to also be thinking about how can you use different types of data in conjunction with one another to make, or to help you inform your decision making. So take, for example, if I was wanting to know my own financial position, okay, I could look at the money that I have in my bank. That could be useful. That gives me a bit of an indication about my cash flow. But that single piece of data alone actually doesn't give me a whole picture of my financial security. If I then took into consideration my mortgage and how much I earn a year, that gives a more well-rounded view of what, you know, how I'm kind of going. But if you had just looked at one of those bits of data alone, it would have really skewed and would have given you probably a really inaccurate view of, you know, how I was going. So when we combine multiple sources of data, we're drawing on different assessment types, different data types. It might be different measures. You know, and last week, JC kind of said to me, well, what data is important? And my answer was, well, you know, almost you tell me. The data that you work with and use every day is what's important to you, and that will change for you no matter what role you're in, what organizational practice you're in, and, you know, what state in Australia you're in, for example. All of those things kind of change. But for you, it's about working out, well, what do you actually care about, what matters, and how can you consider those multiple data sets or metrics side by side to help you inform your decisions. One of the other really kind of key principles that I bring to this conversation is around the idea of we should be using the data to look for really good news stories and the great stuff that's worth celebrating and recognizing in the same way and with the same kind of, I guess, rigor as the way we look for deficits and for gaps. So often when I work with organizations around data, there's some people, and some, maybe this is because some people come to the conversation being quite fearful about data and see it in quite a negative light. But sometimes people default to looking for the gaps and looking for the areas that have underperformed or haven't gone as well as others. And while that's a really important part of data analysis, it is only one part. So we've also got a lot of power in the information that we're given when we start to consider what are the conditions that are actually really working well and flourishing and thriving, and what can we learn from that really good stuff, and how can we replicate that elsewhere. So it's not just about the negatives, it's not just about the gaps. Remember, you know, when you're looking at the data and thinking about data storytelling, it's what can you actually learn from the things that are going really well, because there's always going to be some really good news stories and good pieces of information and insights in the data as well. And the final thing, I guess, in terms of my views on the way that we talk about data and think about it is you might have seen or you might have read Adam Grant's book, Think Again. He released it last year. And he talks about people often thinking in one of three ways, usually. He said, we often think like a politician, a prosecutor, or a preacher. And when we're a politician, our views are that we're trying to persuade somebody else to explain why we're kind of right or trying to get them on board. When we're a prosecutor, we're telling somebody why they're wrong and what's kind of going wrong. And when we're kind of preaching our own message and kind of saying why we're right. And Adam Grant talks about those three mind frames when we think about thinking are really kind of fixed mindsets. And none of them actually allow you to take on new information as it evolves and as things change. So we know the world is dynamic, it's changing. And so the other view that I guess I would encourage you to have when talking about data and thinking about data is really to adopt the fourth mindset that Adam Grant talks about, which is to think like a scientist. So some of you will be scientists already, so this will come really easily to you. But the way he describes it is he says, scientists don't have a fixed view of seeing the world. Scientists collect new information, new evidence. They have a hypothesis. They test that hypothesis. They kind of look to see whether what they think is actually happening is happening, and they test it, and they actually seek out data that disproves what they think. So there's a lot of kind of rigor around developing their thinking. And he says that scientists they hold their thoughts and their beliefs. They hold them with conviction because they've done the research and they've done the work, but they also hold them quite lightly, so that when new information comes to them, they're able to adapt, and they know that their belief and their understanding right now is not going to be their belief and understanding forever necessarily. So I reckon that's a really important skill when we talk about data. We're all learning through this journey. I get to learn every day that I go into new organizations, and it's evolving at such a remarkable pace. And there are so many new types of information that are better than and supersede the old types of information that we've now got access to. And so it's about really kind of, thinking or holding those thoughts lightly and thinking about how we can actually use the information in the best possible way to lead change and lead shifts in our organization. So I'm just going to share screen with you for a second and show you this. So when we talk about data, I've talked a lot about action. And, as I said, the title of this is why having data isn't enough. Because having data alone puts us on this vertical axis. So from no evidence to having evidence. And all of us have got varying degrees of evidence and information available to us. Some of that might be purely access, and it might be permissions and not being able to access some evidence. For some of you, you might have access to a lot of information and evidence, but you're actually not necessarily using it or looking at it very often. Some people are in that, it's down towards the lower part of not having a lot of information, but most organizations that I work with now are certainly kind of in the top 3/4 of that at least. So we're all on that spectrum. But I guess my question to you is, why do we have it? If all we do is collect the data, why? What's the point? Why waste our time and effort and energy collecting it when we're not actually going to do anything with it? So this is where that second horizontal axis comes into play. And when we've got the evidence in the different kind of levels on that continuum, we can then think about, well, are we actually acting on the information and the evidence we've got, or are we not taking any action? So I worked with a senior leader a couple of months ago, and he talked about 10 KPIs that he had for his team. And he came to me and he said, look, Selena, I've got this data summary. It's feedback on the 10 KPIs. I'm about to put a rocket up my staff tomorrow. Can you just double check to make sure that I haven't got it wrong? And it turned out that of those 10 KPIs, the 6 of the 10 KPIs had actually improved quite significantly. And 4 had dropped, but they had dropped by like less than 0.5%. So they had dropped by the tiniest little amount, and the 6 that had improved had increased significantly. So he was going to act on some data and send a message to his staff that was completely inaccurate. So we want to make sure that we're actually understanding the data and understanding the evidence before we take action, because in his case, the messaging would have been completely wrong to his staff. They were actually doing really well. Things were actually going, they made some significant improvements, but he was going to send the wrong message. So when I work with organizations, I could count on one hand the number of organizations I've worked with that are in that stage of stasis. So people in the stage of people or organizations, or teams even. So teams within the organization and individuals within teams or within the organization can all be in different parts of this quadrant model. But people or teams or organizations that are in stasis, they're not harnessing any of the evidence that they've got available to them, and they're not taking any action on any of it. So what that looks like is that's people or a team or an organization who's pretty much doing the same thing year in, year out. They don't really change the model. They, something's worked for them for a number of years, so they just consistently continue to do the same thing. And look, they could continue doing that and they might be very happy doing so, but it's not really necessarily capitalizing on the information that they could possibly get or maximizing the impacts that they could have on their community. So sometimes there's a small percentage of organizations, teams, and individuals that sit in this kind of stage of guesswork. And guesswork is where people don't necessarily look at the information or the evidence that they've got, and they make changes in their practice or in their team or in the processes or the way they do things. But they're not really basing those actions on any evidence. They're just kind of, maybe they heard it from somebody else who's running a different practice and they've kind of heard a good idea and they've thought, hey, let's introduce that or implement that here. But they don't really necessarily have the evidence or have looked at the evidence to back up that decision. So we don't ever want to be in the stage of guesswork. We want to be acting, but we want it to be deliberate and slow and discerning and based on the information that we've actually got in front of us, because none of us will have the same information at any one time. It will always be different. Most often I work with organizations who sit in that top left box in lost opportunity, because they've got heaps of data. They've got more than enough oftentimes, but they're not necessarily acting on it. And, I kind of hate the phrase analysis paralysis. It gets thrown around a lot when I work with organizations in that lost opportunity box, but I also kind of get it, because when you have access to so much information, and, there was one organization I was working with recently, and their dashboards, their visualization dashboards probably would have had, I'm going to guess, about 200 different visualizations. And the staff were sitting there saying, oh, we've got no idea even where to start. So they didn't know what to prioritize, what to focus their attention on. So we want to get out of the stage of lost opportunity. We really want to be able to harness the data that we've got and get into the stage of impact. And when we're having an impact, we're looking at the evidence, and that evidence will be coming from within your organization, within your practice, within your sphere of influence. And you'll also look towards the research evidence to kind of find out, well, what's the research actually telling you is good practice in this space. And you'll be acting on that combination of really good, rigorous, accurate evidence and data, and you're working on it and acting on it at that point in time. So it's current, it's relevant, and you've done your research, you've done your homework, and you're able to have an impact when you start to lead change. So that's ultimately the goal. That's where we really want to get to. But obviously, as the title of this session says, having data isn't enough. We need to be actually doing something with it to get to that stage where we're able to use it to have a real impact on people and the communities that we're in. So I'm just going to pause there for a second, and I'd love you just to have a think about, and you're welcome to drop this into the chat box if you would like to, have a think about what data and evidence do you use or have access to in your role or in your practice, whatever, you'll all come to this conversation in different roles and positions and that sort of thing, and that's absolutely okay. But I want you to have a think about, what do you use and what are some of the challenges that you see with using data well? You're welcome just to think about that and reflect on that, or if you wanted to drop it into the chat, you're very welcome to as well. I'll give you a minute or two to have a think about that. pretty quiet in the chat box today. So some of the, feel free, if you are typing, feel free to keep typing and add that in. But, you know, there's so many different types of data. Obviously, you work with patients and you work with, people with a lot of healthcare data probably attached to them as humans. But at an organizational or a practice level, you'll have, financial data, you'll have all of your HR data, your turnover, the training, you'll have all of that kind of financial information as well. You'll have information about expenses for your business or your practice as well. There is so much available, and it doesn't always just sit in the same domain. There'll be kind of different parts and different sections and chunks to the information you've got. And as I said, in any organization, that's the case. This is about you thinking in your sphere of influence, well, what do I actually care about? What matters to me? How can I use, and then how can I kind of access the data and use it to actually lead change? Because ideally we want to get to that stage of impact. So when it comes to the effective use of data in organizations, in my work that I've done over the number of years in this space, these are the 3 big ticket items that really stand out. So the first one's data literacy. And data literacy is an understanding of what the numbers mean. So before we can expect anybody to be able to go and act on data or use some visualizations, they actually need to understand the metrics. So for example, if I was to, in a healthcare example, if I was to take as simple as weigh somebody and measure their height, my understanding of those numbers is very different to the numbers of taking somebody's blood pressure. It's very different to the numbers that I would get if I did a blood test on somebody. So we can't expect people to use the numbers themselves unless they understand the context, they understand the actual measure and the metric, and they know what's good, what's low, what's concerning, what's extremely high, what's extremely low. And that's true for any type of data that you work with. So even in terms of like your staff turnover in your practice, your retention, your absentee rate, any of those things, all of them needs to have and does have its own context that sits around it. Charles Seif wrote a book called Proofiness, You're Being Fooled by the Numbers. And I really like this quote that he used in that, because he said, nobody cares about the number 5. He said, it's until we put a context around the number that people start to care. So if I ate 5 hamburgers, or if I won $5 million, or if I own 5 dogs, all of those things mean something completely different, but it was all to do with the number 5. So that's what data literacy is. It's really kind of understanding that context and what the numbers actually mean, because if we can't do that, we can't actually progress and move on. The second part of the effective use of data in organizations is around this idea of data visualization. And, over the next couple of days, you're going to be hearing a lot about cloud services, and particularly health information technology and different kind of platforms, hopefully, that you might be able to use in different ideas in that way. Visualizations are vital in the use of data, because what they do is they make the trends more easily identifiable. They can combine up to, well, potentially millions of data points in one view or one visualization. And that's super important, because it means that we're not trawling through, spreadsheets of just raw data. Nobody's got time for that. And it's actually a complete waste of our time, because that's not what we should be investing time and effort and resources into. So visualizations are really beneficial and really useful, because they cut down the thinking time, and they require less cognitive load than sorting through all of the numbers themselves. So they're great, they save time, they help us understand what's actually going on. There's kind of 2 parts to the visualization then for you and for the teams that you work with. If you're given a visualization, so if you've got a technology platform that shows you some of your organizational or practice data, you need to be able to read the visualizations that you are given and that you can see. So if I was to give you a box and whisker plot of some patient information, you need to actually have the visualization skill and understanding to be able to read and interpret that information. You know, we see bar graphs and line graphs often, so they're things that do become a little bit easier to us, but there are things like, say, lollipop graphs and waterfall graphs that if your tech solution gives you that information in that way, then you need to be able to read it, because if you can't read it, you can't do the storytelling. The other part of that is sometimes you might actually want to develop your own visualizations. So I'm yet to find the perfect tech platform out there. I'm sure you'll probably hear about some over the next couple of days, but you know, there might be something where you think that's really interesting information. I actually want to do a little bit more digging into this particular part of it. And maybe you're after a visualization that your dashboard doesn't provide you with. If that's the case, that's absolutely okay and completely normal. But you also need the skills to be able to develop that, or at least know what you're after to ask somebody else to be able to do it for you. So there's two parts to that visualization. Can you read it? Can you read the visualizations that you're given and do you know what they mean? And can you ask for or create your own visualizations? But that final part is data storytelling. And data storytelling, you know, is where rubber hits the road. It's the really good stuff. It's where data actually impacts real people in real lives. You could have amazing data literacy. You can have brilliant data visualization, but unless you're actually talking about the humans and the people that you work with and work for, none of those first two things mean anything. So yes, you need great systems. Yes, you need great practices and an understanding, but the priority needs to be in this data storytelling. Some of the industry research around the use of data indicates that from collecting data through to action, about 80% of the time is taken up collecting and organizing and getting the data ready in an appropriate format. And only 20% of the time is actually spent on acting on the data. So what we need to really be doing is trying to think, well, how can we cut down that thinking time and the processing time? And how can we maximize the storytelling? Because when we do the data storytelling, we're kind of thinking about two main things. The first one is, what's the data actually telling me? So we're looking for the insights. We're looking for, you know, what are those things that jump out at me? I read, there's a book by Cole Naflick, and it's called Storytelling with Data. And she uses the analogy of looking through, like looking for insights in data is kind of like looking for looking at oysters to find pearls. So, you know, she says, we look at data, you know, it's like looking at 100 different oysters and finding 2 pearls. That's kind of what our job is. You know, the first part of that data storytelling piece is, well, what's actually important? What are those pearls? What are the things that stand out to me that I actually need to act on or could act on? And then the second part is the so what. What do I now do about that? Now that I know that the data is indicating that, what am I going to do about it? So in data storytelling, you might be doing that as an individual. You could be doing that as a member of a team. So you could look at the data together. You could talk about the insights and the things you notice, and then collectively talk about, well, what does that actually mean for us? What are those next steps? What are we going to put in place to be able to move forward or shift things? Or it could be, you know, if you're an executive and you've got a board, it could be a conversation with your board. I'm sure that they would want to be hearing about solutions, you know, just as much as the insights. So that's the focus, like that's where we want to get. We certainly need the technology that supports that. And as I said, without understanding the numbers and without being able to read the visualizations, we really kind of can't get there, because we can't answer the what's the data actually telling me question if we don't know what the data means. So I guess over the last couple of years, I've been able to work with a range of different organizations in the data storytelling space. And I wanted to share with you, I guess, for the last little part of this session, what I have seen and what I noticed and what I'm learning. And this continues to, you know, be affirmed. And like Adam Grant, I think like a scientist, and, you know, I'm happy for any of these things to be disproved and, you know, change in the future. But the current reality for the organizations that I work with, these are the things that I kind of see them doing that really maximizes their capacity to use their data for good, and to have an impact, rather than kind of it just sitting there and sitting in technology and not really necessarily making things better for anybody. The first one is absolutely that knowing their numbers. I'm just going to plug my book again because I physically have it, but I wrote this and I called it "I'm not a numbers person," because I honestly get so many people come to me all the time and they say to me, "Yes, Selena, I get it, but I'm not a numbers person." And it's not, we can't be like that anymore. The use of data is no longer an analyst's job in our organization, where we go and we ask a question and we get the information back to us. There is an increasing need for everybody in all parts of our organizations and practices to actually know the numbers, to know what it means, to know what they're working towards, to know kind of what they're aiming for, and to at least be able to engage in a conversation and ask questions about, what the information means. Because if you don't have people that can ask good questions, you're massively missing a huge opportunity, and you're running the risk of missing something. So the more people you can upskill in knowing the numbers and knowing what they mean, the more people you have that can kind of critically think about the numbers, the better your organization is going to be, because it massively reduces your risk of missing something or making a mistake. The other thing, and this, I guess, speaks to that idea of the Adam Grant thinking again. Successful organizations are really open to things changing. So gone are the days where we would have a 5 to 10 year strategic plan in an organization. We've realized in the last couple of years that we need to be far more flexible and adaptable to that. And some of the research is kind of even now saying that our plans, our longer term plans or strategic plans, should even be shortened to, say, the next 12 months. And we should be constantly thinking and evolving and adapting those documents as we go. And at a strategic planning level, our strategic plan and goals and vision for the future, all of that is going to filter down into the way your executive or your senior leaders work, to your middle leaders, to your employees, to all the people that work across your organizational practice. And, the more we as leaders can model that willingness to change our mind and to rethink things when we get access to new information, and to shift to meet the current demand or current need and what the current information is telling us about our clients and what our people need, then, it's more effective for the organization to do that. But it also is sending a really clear message to employees and staff that that is what they value. And, if something happens and something changes, that's absolutely okay. And the organizations that I've seen that do this really well, this is authentically embedded into staff culture. This is what we're focusing on, and this is what the data is telling us, and this is why we're doing it. And if and when things change, we're going to kind of look at it again and make any changes that we need to. So really kind of being open to that. When we get stuck in those fixed mindset ideas, or, we've got a 3 to 5 year strategic plan and this is what we're sticking to, that's, when you get conflicting data, people like that, it either throws their plan out and then they get really stressed, or they choose to ignore it, and that's not useful either. Another thing that I've worked a lot on with organizations over the last couple of years is the idea of having a data plan. And right at the beginning of this session, I kind of talked about those increasing expectations of the use of data, but also the increase in the actual sources of information. So we've got access to more data than ever before. And one of the things I've noticed, and I see when I go into different places, is that often the data that they've always had, so data that they might have had access to 5 to 10 years ago, it hasn't necessarily been removed. It doesn't necessarily disappear. There's a whole lot of stuff just being added on top. So increasingly, organizations are actually developing a bit of a plan for what they use the data for and when. And it's a really good process, both for the people that are running that process and go through the actual thinking of what do we care about, what are we valuing, how are we, asking people to use the information that they've got access to. But it's really useful for every employee in the organization, because it outlines to them what the expectation is. So rather than just kind of expecting people to use data in their role and to be responsive and to act on the information they're given, data plans can help really kind of nut out some of that detail. You might have different teams or different levels in your practice or in your organization. And so your data plan could actually have different categories or different sections for those different groups. What it can include is like, well, what information do you actually want them to look at? You can, and there's so much flexibility with how data plans can be created, but you know, you can put in, well, how often do you actually want them reviewing it? At what, where are they doing that? Like, how are they, where is that kind of the time being allocated for that? And one of the things, I guess, and I see a really important distinction and difference between a data schedule and a data plan. A data schedule is often like the points where we're running reports and we're kind of collecting the information. But a data plan is more than that, because it also has, it can have things like suggested analysis. So ideas or prompts for people to know what they should or could be looking for. And also then possible actions. So if you think, if you walk into your organization and there's an expectation that you're using data and you've got no idea how to do that, or you're not 100% sure what that looks like, if you get handed a document that tells you, you need to look at this, this, and this for this purpose, this is how often you do it, and then these are some of the things you should be looking for, and this is how you would use the data, that's really clarifying. And so, yeah, the organizations that I've worked with are all using data plans, have developed data plans, and can't speak highly enough of them. It is also a really good process for the leaders to go through as well, because while there is so much information, if you haven't kind of taken that time to zoom out and think about, well, what do we actually care about? What matters to us? And how are we going to use it? It actually is really helpful, because it helps you cut out some of that noise of the, you know, of all those millions of different data points and sources that we could possibly use. So it's helpful at multiple levels. You know, if I give you the part that applies to you, the other really good thing is that you can see how that fits into everybody else's plan and what their expectations are for them as well. So yeah, I'm very pro data plans. It's probably unsurprising to hear. Another one is speaking really positively about data with employees. So it's a pretty hard sell and hard slog if we said to people, okay, we want you to use data, but it's because the board told us to, or I just need you to do this. Let's just tick the box. Let's get it over and done with, and let's just move on. So I've seen leaders do that, and I've seen them fail pretty badly. And I've seen the complete opposite, where leaders are interested in the data, they're passionate about it, they're really open about not having all the answers, you know, really open kind of mindset to, you know, let's change priorities if we need to. If you see new data, if there are new insights, we can rethink things. And everybody kind of fits somewhere on that continuum. And I can tell you the number of organizations I've been into where the leaders are like that. When the leaders are positive and they're leading this, that's when you get staff buy-in.